Eliza Carter slammed her last coin onto the stagecoach driver's palm and watched him flick it into the air without a second glance. "End of the line, ma'am. Willow Creek." She didn't move. "Ma'am?" He said it again, flatter this time. "I've got another run." She stepped down. The wind hit her like a stranger's hand, rough, indifferent, not caring at all where she'd come from or what she'd left behind. If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go. The stagecoach was gone before the dust settled. Eliza Carter stood at the edge of Willow Creek, Texas, with a worn leather bag in her right hand and nothing else. No second bag, no coin purse, no return ticket. The leather was scuffed at the corners from a journey that had started in Philadelphia 3 weeks ago, back when she'd still believed something would change before it got this bad. Nothing had changed. It had only gotten worse. She was 43 years old, and she was starting over with what a woman her age wasn't supposed to have left nothing. The town around her was exactly what the newspapers hadn't warned her about. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't wild and free the way the dime novels described the West. It was dry and loud in a specific way. Men's boots on wooden boards, a horse protesting somewhere behind a fence, a door banging open and shut in the wind. It smelled like dust and leather and smoke from a fire somewhere she couldn't see. It looked like a place that had never once worried about what a person from Philadelphia thought of it. She squared her shoulders and walked toward the first building with a door that looked like it might belong to someone reasonable. The general store. A man behind the counter looked up when she came in. He was perhaps 60, with the face of someone who'd seen most things and been surprised by very few of them. He took her in the dress that was clean but dated the bag that was light, the posture that was still trying. "Passing through?" he asked. "Looking for work," Eliza said. "I have an advertisement." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The edges were soft from being opened and closed too many times. She'd read it so often she had it memorized, but she handed it to him anyway because she needed to see his face when he read it. He looked at it. His expression didn't change exactly, but something shifted behind his eyes. "Circle M," he said. "Yes." "You're applying to cook at Circle M Ranch." "I am." He set the paper down on the counter and looked at her the way a doctor looks at someone who's already made up their mind about something inadvisable. "How long have you been in Texas, ma'am?" "I arrived approximately 4 minutes ago." He almost smiled. Almost. "And you've already decided on Circle M?" "I've already decided on surviving," Eliza said. "Circle M is the only advertisement I found that offered room and board alongside wages. That's what I require." The man leaned back against the shelf behind him. A jar of something rattled gently. "Ma'am, I don't know what brought you out here from—" He glanced at her clothes, her speech the particular way she held herself, "wherever you've come from. And I'm not going to ask. But I'm going to tell you one thing about Cole Harrison and that ranch because it's the honest thing to do before you ride out there." "Go ahead," she said. "He's lost 4 cooks in 8 months. Last one stayed 11 days. Woman before that 3 weeks. Man before her didn't even last a full week." "What happened to them?" "Nothing dramatic," the man said. "That's the thing. No cruelty, no danger. They just left. Said it wasn't what they expected. Said it was too isolated, too hard, too quiet. Said the man himself was impossible to work for." "Is he—" A pause. "Cole Harrison is a good man," he said carefully, "who has forgotten for the time being how to be around people." Eliza picked the advertisement back up off the counter and folded it along its original creases. "Then it sounds," she said, "like he needs a cook who isn't planning to leave." She got directions. She got pointed toward a man named Pete, who ran a small livery and sometimes hauled supplies out toward the eastern ranches. Pete agreed to take her out to Circle M that afternoon for 50 cents, which she didn't have, and then for the jar of good Philadelphia jam she had packed at the very bottom of her bag, because she hadn't been able to make herself leave it behind. Pete accepted the jam without ceremony, and told her to be ready in an hour. She spent that hour sitting on the steps outside the general store, watching Willow Creek go about its business. A group of ranch hands walked past and glanced at her with the open curiosity of men who didn't see unaccompanied women sitting on steps very often. A woman about her own age passed with a basket over her arm and gave her a look that was not unfriendly but also was not warm. The look of someone who has learned to be careful about what she offers strangers. Eliza didn't take it personally. She understood the economy of caution. She thought about Robert. She didn't want to, but the mind did what it wanted in quiet moments, and Robert was still the shape her thoughts reached for when there was nothing else to hold. Robert Carter, who had been a physician with good hands and a better heart, who had genuinely believed that a man could trust other men if he treated them honestly, who had invested everything, their savings, their home, their future into a partnership with two colleagues he'd known for 15 years, who had been wrong. The partnership collapsed. The colleagues vanished. The debt arrived in legal documents that made Eliza's hands shake when she read them. Robert, in the middle of all of it, had gotten sick with a speed that felt almost deliberate, as though his body had decided that if the life they'd built wasn't going to survive, neither was he. He died in February. By April, Eliza had sold the furniture. By June, she had sold the house. By July, she was reading advertisements in newspapers, looking for something, anything, that offered a bed and a wage in exchange for skills she actually had. She could cook. She had cooked for Robert and for their household for 22 years. She had cooked for dinner parties and medical colleagues and church gatherings. She had cooked for a sick husband in his last months, learning what he could tolerate and what his body rejected, calibrating every meal with the precision of someone who understood that food was medicine and comfort and love all at once. She could cook, and Circle M Ranch needed a cook. It was in the stripped-down arithmetic of survival enough. Pete's wagon was not comfortable. The road out to Circle M was not a road so much as an intention, two tracks pressed into the earth by repeated use running through scrub and rock, and the occasional low tree that reached out like it was trying to stop you from continuing. Pete didn't talk much, which Eliza appreciated. She didn't feel like explaining herself. She watched the landscape instead, trying to understand it, trying to find the thing about it that she could hold on to. She found it in the sky. The sky in Texas was a different object than the sky in Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, you saw sky in pieces between buildings above parks in narrow strips above the street. Here the sky was the whole fact of the world. It went in every direction at once, enormous and indifferent, and somehow in its sheer indifference more honest than any sky she'd seen before. It didn't care about her debt. It didn't care about her grief. It didn't care about her age or her widow's status or whether she'd made the right decision getting on that stagecoach. It just was. She found to her surprise that she didn't hate that. Circle M Ranch appeared from the landscape without warning, a cluster of buildings that became visible all at once as Pete's wagon crested a low rise. Main house, long and practical. Bunkhouse set at an angle. Several outbuildings. A corral where horses moved in the afternoon light. Fence lines running out toward the horizon in both directions. It was substantial. Larger than she'd imagined. The advertisement had said ranch, but she'd pictured something modest. This was not modest. This was a serious operation, the kind of place where real work happened at real scale, and where a cook wasn't a luxury, but a logistical necessity. 15 men, the advertisement had said. She was feeding 15 men 3 times a day. She counted the fences. She counted the outbuildings. She recalculated. Big spread, Pete said, because apparently he talked now. Yes, Eliza said. Harrison runs it himself mostly. Takes on hands for the big seasons, keeps a core crew year-round. Pete glanced at her. He's not a bad man. I want to be clear about that. I've known Cole Harrison for going on 12 years. He's not bad. He's just difficult, Eliza offered. Grieving, Pete said. And then he didn't say anything else. The wagon pulled up to the front of the main house and stopped. Pete set the brake with the ease of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. Nothing happened for a moment. Then the front door opened and a man came out. Cole Harrison was not what she'd expected, and Eliza Carter had been making a conscious effort to expect nothing specifically to avoid this problem. He was tall, in the way of men who'd done physical labor their whole lives, not bulky but built solid with the kind of leanness that comes from actual use rather than intention. Late 30s, maybe early 40s, dark hair going gray at the temples, a face that had once known how to arrange itself pleasantly and had simply stopped practicing. He looked at Pete. He looked at the wagon. His eyes came to Eliza and stayed there for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to take her in, completely short enough not to be rude about it. "This is her," he said to Pete. "This is her," Pete agreed. Cole Harrison looked at Eliza for another moment. "You read the advertisement?" he asked. "Thoroughly," she said. "You understand what the work is. 3 meals a day, 15 men. Early start. No days off during drive season. I understand. You've cooked at this scale before." She had not cooked at this scale before. She had cooked for dinner parties of 12. She had read the advertisement specifications carefully and done the math and decided she could learn what she didn't know. "I've cooked for large groups," she said, which was true. Cole Harrison looked at her for another beat. He had the eyes of someone who was very good at detecting the particular quality of an answer that was technically true. "All right," he said. "Pete, she's staying." Then he turned and went back inside. Pete helped her down from the wagon and carried her bag to the door. He paused before he left. "Kitchen's at the back of the main house," he said. "Tom Bradley, the young one, Tom. He'll show you around. He's a good kid." "Thank you," Eliza said. "For the jam," he said, and then he was gone. She stood in the doorway. The inside of the main house was clean, but stripped of anything decorative. Functional. A place organized entirely around work and nothing else. No curtains on the windows. No rugs on the floor. Furniture that had once been good quality and was now just useful. A fireplace with no ornaments on the mantel. Walls with nothing on them, except in one corner, a small framed photograph she couldn't quite see from where she was standing. She didn't look too long. This was not her house. She was here to cook. The kitchen, when she found it, was at least well equipped. Whoever had set it up had understood that 15 men needed industrial-scale feeding. A stove larger than anything she'd worked with in Philadelphia. Iron pots hanging in rows. A dry goods larder that was decently stocked. A work table long enough to be genuinely useful. She stood in the middle of it and did a careful inventory. She opened every cabinet. She examined the stove. She found the water pump and tested it. She calculated the flour and beans and salt and understood immediately that she was going to have to make a list of what needed to be ordered. "You're the new cook?" She turned. Standing in the kitchen doorway was a young man, 20 maybe, with an open, sunburned face and eyes that were attempting to be welcoming and cautious at the same time. He had the build of someone who'd been doing hard physical work since he was a boy and had recently grown into it properly. "I am," she said. "Tom." He looked surprised she knew his name. "Yes, ma'am. Tom Bradley." He came in and extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was careful in the way young men are careful when they're trying to show respect to someone older. "I'm supposed to help you get settled, show you where everything is." "That would be appreciated," she said. "Tell me about the men's schedules. When do they eat, and what are they expecting?" Tom blinked. He'd apparently been prepared for questions about where to find the salt. "Breakfast at 5:30. They're out before first light during the week." "What do they eat?" "Whatever's made," he said carefully. "What did the previous cooks make?" He thought about it. "Biscuits, bacon when we have it, beans, cornbread. And for dinner?" "Stew mostly. Sometimes roasted meat if Mr. Harrison's arranged it. Beans again." "And the men, are they content with this?" Tom Bradley paused. He had the face of someone who has been asked a question with a clearly correct answer and a clearly true answer, and who is deciding which one to give. "They eat what's put in front of them," he said finally. Eliza nodded. She turned back to the larder and continued her inventory. "Tom," she said, "what time is it now?" "About 3:30. "And dinner is at what time?" 6. She looked at the larder. She looked at the stove. She looked at what she had to work with. "Then I need to get started," she said. Dinner that first night was not a triumph. She had 2.5 hours to produce a meal for 15 men using an unfamiliar stove that ran hot on the left side, in a way she only discovered when her biscuits came out burnt on that edge. The beans were fine. Beans were patient and forgiving. The biscuits were uneven. The coffee was good. She'd always been reliable with coffee. The men came in from the work of the day and sat in rows along the 2 long tables in the dining room adjacent to the kitchen. They were tired in the bone-deep way of men who had been doing hard physical labor since before the sun was properly up. They washed their hands at the basin on the porch and came in without much conversation. They looked at the food. Nobody said anything. They ate. Cole Harrison sat at the far end of the table, which she understood to be the head. He ate without looking up. He didn't comment on the biscuits. He didn't comment on anything. He ate his meal in about 12 minutes, drank his coffee, and left the table. The other men finished more slowly, and a few of them nodded at her as they passed back out. Not thanks exactly, more acknowledgement. The recognition that food had been made and eaten and the transaction of dinner was complete. Tom Bradley was the only one who paused. "The coffee was real good," he said. "The biscuits weren't," she replied. He considered this. "The left side ones were a little dark," he admitted. "The stove runs hot on the left," she said. "I know that now. I won't know it again tomorrow." He nodded, satisfied by this answer, and went to join the other men. Eliza stood in the kitchen alone and looked at the damage. The pots to be washed, the biscuit tray with its uneven results, the table to be cleared. Her feet hurt. Her back hurt. She was 50 miles from the nearest person who knew her name and cared about the answer. She began washing the pots. The first week was an education in failure, not catastrophic failure. She'd known. Catastrophe knew what it actually felt like, and this wasn't that. This was the smaller, persistent failure of doing a thing imperfectly and having to do it again the next day, and get slightly less imperfect, and then again and again. The stove, the quantities, the timing, the difference between cooking for 12 in a well-appointed Philadelphia kitchen and cooking for 15 hard-working men who needed real fuel for real labor. The biscuits improved. The men noticed. They didn't say anything, but she observed the difference between men eating something adequate and men eating something better. The adequate version was silent and efficient. The better version had a slightly different quality to it, a slowing and extension, a reaching for the second serving with less hesitation. Cole Harrison remained unchanged. He came to meals. He ate. He left. He gave her orders about quantities and schedules through Tom Bradley, as though he couldn't quite bring himself to speak to her directly. She didn't push. She had pushed enough people in her life and had learned slowly the difference between people who were being difficult and people who were being careful. She thought Cole Harrison was being careful. About what exactly she didn't know yet. But she recognized the posture. On the 5th morning, the water pump in the kitchen seized. She tried it 3 times, got nothing, and went to find Tom. Tom found a ranch hand named Hector, who was apparently good with mechanical things. Hector examined the pump, told her it would take most of the morning to fix, and asked if she needed water brought in from the well by the bunkhouse. "Yes," she said, "immediately. Breakfast is in 40 minutes. Hector looked at her with the expression of a man who has been told something will be done in 40 minutes and is calculating whether that is actually possible. 20 minutes, she amended. "I'll need it in 20 minutes if we're going to have biscuits." Hector went and got 2 other men, and they brought water in less than 15 minutes. She made the biscuits. They were that morning the best she'd made yet. When Cole Harrison reached for a second one, she was the only person who noticed. She noticed because she'd been watching quietly professionally, as a cook watches the table, to understand whether the meal is working. He took the second biscuit and did not look up from his plate. It was, she decided, a beginning. Seng, the day she made the mistake with the salt, was also the day the kitchen became something else. She'd been cooking in a kind of grim-focused efficiency for 9 days, grinding through the work with the determination of someone who has decided that leaving is not an option. And she recognized, approaching the kitchen like a problem to be solved competently, carefully, but without the thing that had always made her cooking more than just food. She'd been surviving it. On the 9th day, she made a pot of stew and grabbed what she thought was the salt canister. It was not the salt canister. It was 3 times more salt than any stew required, and she discovered this only when she tasted it and had to grip the edge of the work table for a moment. The men were going to come in from work in 45 minutes. She did not panic. Panic was a luxury she'd stopped affording herself sometime around the day she'd sold the dining room table. She looked at what she had. She started a second pot. She added potatoes, more beef, more water carrots, a bay leaf she found in the back of the spice shelf where it had been sitting long enough to be nearly flavorless. She split the over-salted stew between the 2 pots to dilute it. She added dried beans she'd soaked that morning. She worked fast, and somewhere in the middle of working fast, something shifted. She stopped calculating and started cooking the way she'd cooked when Robert was sick and she'd needed to make food that meant something. Food that said, "I'm here and you matter, and we're not done yet." Her hands moved from memory. She adjusted by smell and instinct. She found a heel of dried cornbread and crumbled it in to thicken the base. She tasted again. Better. She ground the last of a dried pepper someone had left in the back of the larder. Better still. The men came in. They sat down. They ate. And then something happened that hadn't happened in 9 days, and possibly, from the look of it, in a great deal longer. One of the men laughed. It started over something small, a joke about one of the horses, a remark from the man sitting next to him. But the laughter spread along the table, the way warmth spreads from a fire. And then 2 other men were laughing, and then Tom Bradley said something that set off another round. And then the table was fully genuinely alive in a way that Eliza had not seen in 9 days of cooking for these men. She stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room, and she watched it happen, and she understood. She'd been feeding them. She hadn't been feeding them. There was a difference, and it mattered, and she'd just found it by accident on the day she'd almost ruined dinner. From the far end of the table, Cole Harrison looked up. He didn't look at the men laughing. He looked at Eliza. And for the first time since she'd arrived at Circle M Ranch, he held her gaze. Not for long. 3-4 seconds. Then his eyes dropped back to his plate. But in those 3 or 4 seconds, something moved across his face that she hadn't seen there before. She couldn't name it exactly. It wasn't gratitude, and it wasn't warmth, and it wasn't the beginning of a smile. It was recognition. The particular expression of a person who has forgotten something they used to know and has just unexpectedly been reminded of it. He reached for his coffee and drank it. The men kept laughing. Eliza Carter went back into the kitchen, and she stood at the stove, and she let herself feel just for a moment the specific quality of a thing that had started. She didn't know what it would become. She knew it had started. And she had learned in the arithmetic of loss that had been her education for the last year that a start was everything. The laughter lasted 3 days. Not constant laughter, not the loud, easy kind that fills a room without effort, but the quiet, returning kind. The kind that comes back to a place where it has been absent for a long time, testing the air first, making sure it's safe, and then staying a little longer each time. Eliza heard it at this breakfast table on the 10th morning. A low exchange between 2 of the hands, something about a mule that had opinions about its own schedule. She didn't catch all of it. She caught enough to know it was the kind of joke men make when they're comfortable not performing for anyone, just alive in the ordinary way that people are when food is good and work is bearable and the kitchen smells like something worth coming inside for. She filed that away and kept moving, because she had learned in the 10 days since arriving at Circle M that momentum was the only thing standing between her and the particular kind of despair that came from standing still long enough to feel the full weight of what she'd lost. She didn't have the luxury of stillness. Stillness was where grief lived, and grief was patient, and if she stopped moving long enough, it would find her. So, she moved. Breakfast at 5:15, she'd pushed it back 15 minutes from the previous cook's schedule, because she'd observed that the men needed 20 minutes to get from the bunkhouse to the table, and arriving at a table where food was already waiting produced a different quality of morning than arriving to watch a cook still rushing. Small thing. But she'd noticed the difference in their faces. Cole Harrison had noticed too, though he gave no sign of it. He came to the table at 5:20 and found it ready, and something in his posture on those mornings was marginally less braced than it had been the week before. She noticed. She kept it to herself. The real trouble started on the 11th day, and it started with the stove. She'd understood from the beginning that the stove was temperamental. Left side ran hot. The damper on the firebox stuck if you didn't work it right. The oven temperature was an ongoing negotiation rather than a reliable fact. She'd made her peace with all of this, calibrated her cooking around the stove's particular character, the way you calibrate around a difficult colleague whose work you need anyway. What she hadn't accounted for was the flu. She was in the middle of making cornbread, the good kind with a proper crust, when the kitchen began filling with smoke. Not the normal cooking smoke, not the thin wisps that rose from a healthy fire. This was thick and low and wrong, the kind that meant the chimney wasn't drawing and hadn't been cleaned, probably since the last administration. She pulled the cornbread. She got the fire damped down. She opened the window that was her only real ventilation option and stood in front of it with her eyes watering, thinking through the problem with the particular clarity that comes from not having another option. The men were coming in from the morning shift in approximately 35 minutes. Breakfast was not done. Tom appeared in the kitchen doorway, took one look at the situation and said, "The flu." "Yes," she said. "The flu. It does this every few months. Usually someone climbs up and, can that be done in 35 minutes? He thought about it with the genuine seriousness she'd come to appreciate about Tom Bradley. He was 20 years old, and he took everything she asked him seriously, which was not something she'd been able to count on from every person twice his age. "Maybe," he said, "if Hector does it." "Get Hector." Tom went. She looked at what she had that didn't require the stove. She had biscuits from yesterday. She'd made extra deliberately, learning that surplus was not waste, but insurance. She had cold beans. She had bacon she could do in the skillet over a small wood fire if she moved it to the fireplace in the main room, which was a solution that would require Cole Harrison's permission and would also require her to interrupt whatever Cole Harrison was doing at 5:40 in the morning. She dried her eyes. She went to find him. He was in the room at the back of the house that served as his office, the one room in the building that had paper on the desk and work on the walls. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and his expression did the thing it always did with her, which was to start closed, and then with effort she could see, but he probably didn't know she could see open slightly. "The flue in the kitchen isn't drawing," she said. "I need to use the fireplace in the main room for the bacon. Hector's working on the chimney, but it won't be done before breakfast." A pause. "All right," he said. She had expected an argument. She had prepared for an argument. She stood there for a moment with the argument ready and nowhere to go. "The wood's already laid," he added, and looked back at his papers. She went back to the kitchen. Breakfast was late by 8 minutes, which she spent the entire 8 minutes internally accounting for. The cornbread was done on the second attempt once Hector had the flue clear. The bacon had worked in the fireplace, though it was a less elegant solution than she preferred. The coffee was, as always, reliable. The men ate. They didn't complain about the 8 minutes. She hadn't thought they would. She'd observed that these were men who understood that things went wrong on a ranch and that you solved them and kept moving. What she hadn't expected was old Marcus, who was perhaps the oldest hand on the crew and had said approximately 40 words to her in 11 days, setting down his coffee cup and saying without preamble, "Best bacon we've had in about 6 months." Several men around him nodded. Eliza said, "Thank you, Marcus," and went back to the kitchen before she had to explain why her eyes were doing what they were doing. She stood at the work table and put her hands flat on the surface and breathed. She was still there. She was still standing. That was enough. The thing about a ranch kitchen was that it was never just a kitchen. She understood this by the end of the second week. The kitchen was Logistics Command Medical Station's social hub, and the only room in the operation where people stopped working and sat down for a few minutes at a time. Men came in for water and stayed to talk. Tom came in the afternoons to help her with what she privately categorized as the unskilled but necessary labor peeling, hauling, carrying, and to provide her with a running commentary on the ranch's social landscape that she found more valuable than he probably realized. She learned Marcus had been with Circle M for 17 years and was the unofficial memory of the operation. Hector was 26, had come up from the border country, and could fix anything mechanical, given enough time and the right piece of metal. There was a hand named Davis, who was quiet in the way of someone carrying something specific and who she'd learned not to push. There was Jimmy, who was 19 and homesick in the way that 19-year-olds are homesick loudly, and then suddenly and then quietly for a long time. There was a man named Cobb, who ate more than any two other men combined, and who never in 3 weeks failed to say some version of thank you when he left the table. She learned their preferences. She learned who took sugar and who didn't, who would eat beans without complaint, and who needed something alongside, or the meal felt incomplete. She learned that Marcus had bad teeth that made hard biscuits a problem, and she adjusted the recipe without saying anything. And a week later, Marcus told Tom she was the best cook Circle M had ever had, and Tom told her, and she recalibrated the biscuits back to a slightly better texture and said nothing about any of it. Food was information. Food was relationship. She had always known this, but in Philadelphia, it had been a different kind of knowing. The dinner party, knowing the hospitality, knowing. This was something raw. 15 men a long way from anywhere eating 3 times a day, and every meal was a small statement about whether they mattered. She intended for the answer to always be yes. Cole Harrison remained the variable she couldn't fully read. He ate what she made, and he ate all of it, and she'd stopped finding his first serving plate cleaned in a way that suggested appetite suppressed by courtesy. But he didn't speak to her beyond the necessary. He didn't ask questions. He didn't comment. He existed at that far end of the table as a kind of gravity, the thing everything else in the room oriented around without acknowledgement. On the 14th night, she came out of the kitchen to find the dining room empty, the men already gone, and Cole Harrison still sitting at the table with his coffee. She stopped. He didn't look up immediately. When he did, his expression had the quality of a man who had stayed on purpose, but hadn't fully decided what to do about it. "Sit down," he said. It was not a request exactly. It was not an order exactly. It was something in between the voice of a man who had spent a long time giving instructions and had not yet learned to soften them into invitations. She sat. He looked at his coffee. "The cornbread this week," he said. She waited. "It's different from the first week." "I adjusted the fat ratio," she said. "And the heat. The oven runs cooler on the right side." He nodded slowly. "The men are eating faster," he said. Then, "That's good. They were slow before. Men eat slow when the food's something they're tolerating." She didn't respond to that. She waited to see if there was more. "You're not leaving," he said. It was not a question. "No," she said. 4 cooks before you. All gone by the end of a month." "I heard." He looked at her now directly with the steady attention of a man who was genuinely trying to understand something. "Why are you staying?" She considered the honest answer. The honest answer was that she had nowhere else to go. The honest answer was that she had sold her furniture and her house, and used the last of it to get herself to Texas on the strength of a newspaper advertisement. The honest answer was that this kitchen, difficult and smoky and exhausting as it was the first place in 8 months where she had woken up in the morning with a concrete purpose. She gave him the second most honest answer. "Because I'm good at this," she said, "and because your men need someone who's going to stay." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said exactly as he'd said it about the fireplace. And he picked up his coffee and finished it and left the table. She sat there alone for a moment longer. Then she went and washed the dishes. The crisis arrived without warning, the way every real crisis does. She had been at Circle M for exactly 19 days. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and she was in the middle of making pie. She'd found dried apples in the back of the larder and had been planning it for 3 days when she heard it. The shout from the direction of the corral. Not a work shout, not the raised voices of men redirecting a stubborn animal or calling across distance. This was different, the specific sharp register of emergency, the kind of sound that comes from the throat when something has already gone wrong, and speed is the only variable left that matters. She put the pie down. She moved to the doorway. In the yard, men were running. She identified Tom first. He was moving fast from the bunkhouse toward the corral gate, and his face had the color of someone who has just seen something bad. Hector was already inside the corral. Marcus was not running. He was standing at the fence calling out to the men inside, his voice steadier than anyone else's, the voice of 17 years of knowing what to do when it mattered. And then she saw what it was. A horse had come down wrong. She could see it from the position of the men, the way they were arranged around a point on the ground, the way Hector was crouched, and the way Tom had both hands on the fence and was calculating whether to go in. And on the ground, not moving correctly, was Jimmy. 19-year-old homesick Jimmy. She was already moving. She went back to the kitchen first. This was the part people never understood about emergency, that the first 30 seconds were for thinking, not running. She opened the cabinet where she kept the supplies she'd quietly assembled over her first 2 weeks, clean linen she'd torn into strips, the bottle of carbolic she'd found in the back of a shelf, and moved to where she could reach it, a length of clean cord. She'd done this without explanation, and Tom had noticed and hadn't asked, and she'd been grateful for that. She took what she needed and went out. "Let me through," she said at the corral fence. The men turned. Several of them had the expression of people who were going to object, not from cruelty, but from the automatic response of men who have managed emergencies a particular way, and don't, in the moment of the emergency, have the capacity to update their assumptions. Marcus looked at what she was carrying. He looked at her face. "Let her through," he said. They let her through. Jimmy was conscious, which was the first thing she checked. Conscious, pale, and making the particular sound of someone who is trying not to make the sound they are actually making, the bitten-back controlled noise of a young man who has decided that whatever else happens, he is not going to cry in front of everyone. His left arm was wrong. She'd seen enough of her husband's work to know immediately. The angle of it, the way Jimmy held everything from the shoulder down with absolute stillness, the swelling already visible, not shattered, not compound. A clean break probably of the forearm, painful, serious, absolutely manageable if handled correctly. "Jimmy," she said, and crouched beside him. "Mrs. Carter," he said through his teeth. "I'm going to look at your arm. I need you to stay as still as you can. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am." A beat. "Is it bad?" "It's broken," she said, because she'd learned that people who are injured often do better with honesty than with the uncertainty of being managed. "But it's the kind of broken that heals cleanly if it's set right. That's what I'm going to do." Silence from the men around her, the particular silence of people who have stopped everything to listen. "You know how to do that?" Jimmy asked. "My late husband was a physician," she said. "I assisted him. I've done this before." "Not precisely this," a voice said in her head. She told the voice to be quiet. She worked quickly and carefully. She talked to Jimmy while she worked, nothing consequential, just a steady presence of words, because her husband had taught her that pain was more manageable when the mind had something to do. She explained what she was doing before she did it. She told him when something was going to hurt. It hurt. He made the sound anyway, the bitten back sound, and then she had it aligned and splinted with the length of flat wood Tom had brought her without being asked, and wrapped, and Jimmy's color was coming back slightly. "It'll need a doctor to look at it," she said. "But it's set and it's stable. He needs to ride to Willow Creek tomorrow when he's less shocky from the pain." She stood. The men around her were quiet in a different way now. Not the silence of watching something unknown. The silence of men who have seen competence applied at the moment it was needed and are recalibrating what they thought they knew. Marcus looked at her with the expression of someone who has revised a calculation. Tom Bradley looked at her like she had just appeared in a way she hadn't appeared before. Not different, but more fully there, more real, more the actual shape of the person she was. And Cole Harrison, who she hadn't noticed arrive, who was standing at the edge of the group and had clearly been there long enough to see all of it. Cole Harrison looked at her with an expression she couldn't categorize at all. It wasn't the recognition from the dining room that night. It wasn't the steady assessment he'd given her on the first day. It was something that moved through his face the way weather moves across open country, visible and significant and impossible to stop once it's begun. He looked at her. She looked back. "Thank you," he said. His voice was different. Lower, somehow. Stripped of the practiced distance he usually kept in it. "He needs water and rest and something to eat that's gentle on the stomach," she said, because she needed to be practical right now, or she was going to do something useless like feel the full weight of what had just happened. "I'll put something together." She walked back to the kitchen. She stood at the work table, and her hands were shaking not from fear, but from the release of the concentration she'd held absolutely still for the last 20 minutes. Her husband had told her once that the shaking afterward was not weakness. It was the body accounting for itself, tallying the expenditure of focus, making sure everything was still there. She breathed. She filled the kettle. She put it on the stove. Tom came into the kitchen 2 minutes later. He stood in the doorway. He didn't say anything right away. "The arm's going to be fine," he said finally. "He's already complaining about missing the drive next week, which I guess means he's going to be all right." "He is," she said. Tom was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Carter, how'd you know what to do, the setting the way you wrapped it?" "Practice," she said. "And a good teacher." "Your husband?" "Yes." Another pause. Tom had the quality she'd come to know of someone who felt things strongly and took time to decide whether to say them. "The men are going to remember that," he said. "What you did today. They're not going to forget it." She didn't answer. She made Jimmy's broth. She made the apple pie too because she'd planned it, and because she'd learned from 20 years of cooking through hard days and harder nights that sometimes you finish the thing you started because finishing it is its own kind of defiance. The men had apple pie with dinner that night. Cobb had 2 slices and looked like he might say something meaningful about it, and then decided the eating was sufficient. Marcus, leaving the table, stopped beside her. 17 years at this ranch?" he said. "That's the first time any cook has come running to the corral." He went out. She cleared the table. Later, much later, the bunkhouse long quiet. The ranch settling into its nighttime sounds, she was in the kitchen writing her supply list for the week when she heard the main house door. Footsteps in the hallway. A pause outside the kitchen. Cole Harrison appeared in the doorway. He was still dressed from the day, which meant he hadn't slept. He looked at her, and then at the paper in front of her, and then at the kitchen in general, the way a man looks at a room he thought he knew and is discovering he doesn't fully know anymore. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you," she replied. A silence. He came in further, not all the way, not to the table, but past the threshold, which was further than he'd been in her kitchen before. "I lost someone," he said. She waited. "My wife. 3 years ago." He said it the way people say things they've said so many times in their head that saying it out loud doesn't feel real. "And a child. Fever, both of them. A week apart." She didn't say she was sorry. She'd been on the receiving end of enough sorries to know they were not nothing, but they were also not enough, and a man like Cole Harrison would not want not enough. She said, "What was her name?" He looked at her. Something shifted in his face, the same weather moving across open country expression from the corral, but slower. "Anne," he said. "And the child." A pause. "We'd only had him 6 weeks. We called him Daniel." Silence fell between them like something gentle. "My husband's name was Robert," she said. He was a good man who trusted the wrong people and died believing the world was honest. Cole was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you came west?" "I came west because I had nowhere east left to stand," she said. "But I'm staying because—" She looked at the supply list in front of her because this kitchen needs someone who's planning to be here tomorrow. She could feel him looking at her. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'm going to have someone fix the latch on the kitchen window. It's been loose for 2 months." It was the least romantic thing anyone had said to her in years. It was also, she realized, the most significant offer she'd received since arriving at Circle M Ranch, the offer of tomorrow extended plainly by a man who had not been planning tomorrows. "Thank you," she said. He left. She sat for a moment longer in the quiet kitchen, listening to the ranch settle around her. Then she picked up her pencil and she finished her supply list and she planned breakfast. The kitchen window latch was fixed by 7 the next morning. Eliza didn't see Cole do it. She came in from checking on Jimmy, who had slept badly but eaten the broth, and was already arguing with Tom about whether a broken arm truly prevented a man from doing light fence work, and found the latch sitting flush and solid. The kind of repair that had clearly been done by someone who knew what they were doing and had done it early before anyone was watching. She tested it twice. It held. She put the kettle on and didn't say anything to anyone about it. But she noticed. She cataloged it alongside the fireplace permission, and the 2 seconds longer, he'd held her gaze across the corral, and the way he'd said Anne, like the name was still something he carried in his chest, rather than just in his memory. She filed all of it in the part of her mind she kept separate from the daily work, not because she was building toward something, but because she was a woman who had learned the hard way that the details were where the truth lived. The large gestures were easy to misread. The small ones were honest. A fixed window latch done before dawn by a man who had work of his own to get to. That was honest. She made breakfast. She made it well. The men came in from the cold morning, and the table was warm, and the biscuits were right, and the coffee was strong, and something about the morning had a slightly different quality than the ones before it, a looseness, a breath let out. Jimmy ate at the table with his arm in the sling she'd fashioned, looking sheepish about the fuss, and gratified by it, at the same time the way 19-year-olds are when they've been genuinely scared and are now safely on the other side of it. Cole came to breakfast and ate and left. He didn't say anything to her directly. But when he passed through the kitchen doorway, he paused for just a moment, not long enough to be called stopping, but long enough to be called deliberate, and then continued on. She let herself feel the warmth of that for exactly as long as it took to drink half a cup of coffee. Then she started on the lunch planning. There was work to do. There was always work to do. And she had learned in 21 days at Circle M that the work was not the enemy, the work was the structure, and the structure was what kept her upright on the days when the grief tried to find the cracks. She kept moving. What changed after the corral incident was not dramatic. It was not a single conversation or a declared shift or anything that could be pointed to and named. It was the kind of change that happens in the way water works on stone, not visible in any individual moment, only apparent when you look at the whole shape of the thing and realize it's different from what it was. The men started talking to her. Not just Tom, who had always talked to her, and not just Marcus's occasional pronouncements, which she'd come to understand were his version of high praise, delivered in the vocabulary of a man who'd forgotten how to be effusive. The others. Hector told her about the ranch he'd grown up on south of the border, the way his grandmother had made tortillas at 4 in the morning, and how the smell of the corn mesa still hit him. Sometimes without warning. Davis. Quiet, carrying something. Davis came in one afternoon while she was doing prep, and stood at the work table and talked for 15 minutes about his daughter in San Antonio, who was 7 and was apparently learning to read at a pace that made him visibly emotional, even in the retelling. Cobb told her about his mother's cobbler recipe, and then couldn't remember half the ingredients, and they spent a genuinely enjoyable 20 minutes reconstructing it from what she had in the larder. She listened to all of it. She asked the right questions. She did not offer unsolicited opinions or advice, because she understood that what these men were giving her was not a problem to be solved, but a confidence to be held, and that the holding of it was its own kind of nourishment for them, and she was honest enough to admit for her. She had been lonely. She had been lonely in Philadelphia in the last months of Robert's illness, when the world had contracted to the size of the sick room, and the people who might have helped had quietly disappeared once it became clear the Carters' situation was not recoverable. She had been lonely on the stagecoach west, surrounded by strangers moving toward their own futures. She had been lonely in the first weeks at Circle M, in the specific way of a person who is surrounded by people but has not yet become real to them. She was becoming real. It was not a comfortable process. Becoming real to people meant they could see you, which meant they could also see the places where you were held together with effort and determination, rather than with ease. But she had survived worse uncomforts, and she preferred the exposure of being seen to the protection of invisibility. And then, on a Thursday afternoon, 3.5 weeks in, Cole Harrison came to find her in the kitchen. Not at mealtime, not in the late-night quiet, in the middle of the afternoon when she was doing the accounts. She had taken over the accounts by default and by necessity. She'd found them on the kitchen shelf on her second week, a ledger recording food costs and supply orders, and discovered they were 6 weeks behind and contained at least 3 errors that were costing the ranch money. She'd corrected the errors and caught up the entries, and hadn't said anything to anyone about it because it was her kitchen and her larder, and she needed accurate numbers to plan the meals properly, and she'd considered it part of the job. Cole stood in the doorway and looked at the ledger open in front of her. "That's the kitchen account book," he said. "It was 6 weeks behind," she said. A pause. "You updated it." "There were also 3 calculation errors. I corrected them. You were overpaying the dry goods supplier by about $4 a month." She turned the ledger to show him. "I've marked them here." He came forward and looked. He studied the page for a long moment, with the expression of a man who is doing the mental work of updating his understanding of a situation. $4 a month, he said. Over a year, that's $48. He looked at her. "Where did you learn accounts?" "I kept my husband's practice records for 20 years, she said. "And then I kept our personal accounts when his practice collapsed, which involved considerably more mathematics in considerably less pleasant circumstances." Cole was quiet for a moment. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, which he had not done before, had not come to the table in her kitchen, and sat down as though he intended to be there for longer than it took to deliver an instruction. He put his forearms on the table. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Go ahead." "The men's wages are behind by 2 weeks. I'm waiting on payment from the cattle buyer in Abilene. It should come, but it's late, and the men don't know the full picture." He looked at her steadily. "They're going to feel it. The mood on a ranch goes bad fast when men think they're not getting paid. I've seen it turn." A pause. "You have more conversation with them than I do right now. I'm not asking you to lie or manage them. I'm asking, is there anything in that kitchen that can hold the mood for the next 10 days? She looked at him for a moment. He had just asked her for help. Not the functional help of feeding men, that was the job, and he'd been comfortable assigning that from day one. This was different. This was a man who ran his operation alone, who had run it alone for 3 years, who had closed himself off from needing anyone's input or assistance, asking her what she thought, asking her to be part of the solution. She thought about it seriously, because he deserved a serious answer. "Men's morale," she said, "is more connected to whether they feel seen than whether they're comfortable. I can make the meals better this week. I can do the roast I've been planning. I need the right cut of meat, which means Tom needs to go to town. And I want to do a proper Sunday dinner, not a work meal. A real dinner, the kind that says you matter enough for someone to put effort into." He listened. "And," she said, "you should eat with them. Not at the head of the table reading accounts in your head. Actually eat with them, talk to them. They work for a man they respect, but they need to feel that the man sees them." A silence. "I'm not good at that," he said. "I know," she said. "Do it anyway." He looked at her with the expression she was coming to know, the weather-moving expression, the one that meant something was happening in him, that he hadn't cleared with himself yet. Then he nodded. "I'll arrange the cut of meat," he said, and left. Sunday dinner was a revelation. She had Tom slaughter the right animal. She spent Saturday night on the preparation. She made a roast that would have been at home on a good Philadelphia table, not fancy, but substantial, the kind of cooking that declared itself as an event rather than just a meal. She made 2 kinds of bread. She made gravy that took 2 hours and was worth it. She made a pudding from dried fruit and the last of the sugar, which was an act of faith because she'd have to order more sugar, and she wasn't certain the order would arrive before she needed it again. The men came to dinner and stopped when they saw the table. Not for long, but there was a moment, a collective simultaneous pause, where 15 men recognized that something different was happening and took a breath before sitting down. Cole sat at the head of the table and did what she'd told him to do. He talked to them. It was not natural, and it was not smooth, and she could see the effort in his jaw and his shoulders as she moved between kitchen and table. But he asked Hector about the fence repair on the north line, and he asked Marcus about the horse that had been favoring its left foreleg, and he asked Jimmy how the arm was healing, and the men answered him, and the dinner had a quality to it that she felt more than heard. At the end of the meal, Marcus raised his coffee cup. He didn't make a speech. Marcus was not a speech-making man. He just raised his cup in Eliza's direction and said, "Ma'am." Every man at the table raised his cup. She was standing in the kitchen doorway. She nodded once because she was not going to cry at the dinner table and went back to the stove. Cole found her in the kitchen an hour later. "The payment from Abilene is coming Tuesday," he said. "I heard this afternoon. Wire from the buyer." "Good," she said. "The dinner tonight." He stopped, started again. "The men needed that." "Yes," she said. "So did I," he said quietly. She looked at him. He was not a man who said things like that easily. She could see what it had cost him, the slight tightness around the eyes, the careful set of his shoulders, the way he was holding himself very still, as though movement might undo the sentence he'd just said. She gave him something back. "So did I," she said. The twist came on a Tuesday, not the Tuesday of the Abilene payment, which arrived as promised and restored the payroll and produced a visible lightening across the whole crew. A different Tuesday 2 weeks later, when a man Eliza had never seen before, rode into the ranch yard and asked for Cole Harrison. She knew something was wrong before she knew why she knew it. The man's manner at the door, the way he didn't give his name when Tom answered, the way he looked past Tom into the house, rather than waiting politely. It was the posture of someone who had come to deliver something unwelcome and had decided that speed was the strategy. She was in the hallway when Cole came to meet him. She didn't move. She wasn't hiding. She was standing at the end of the hallway with a dish towel in her hands, having come from the kitchen, and the 2 men were at the front door, and neither of them looked at her. The man handed Cole a folded document. She watched Cole open it. She watched his face as he read it. The weather-moving expression didn't come this time. What came instead was something flat and hard and cold, the face of a man receiving news that confirms a fear he'd been carrying quietly for a long time. "When?" Cole said. Not a question. A reckoning. 30 days, the man said. "That's what the banks authorized me to tell you." A silence. "The mortgage was restructured after my wife died," Cole said. His voice was level, but wrong level, the way a board is level over a hole covering something. "I've been making payments." "Not the restructured amount," the man said. "The original terms reverted 6 months ago. There's a balance due, Mr. Harrison. 30 days before the bank begins foreclosure proceedings." Cole held the paper and said nothing. The man left. Cole stood in the hallway with the document in his hand and didn't move for a long moment. Then he became aware of Eliza at the other end of the hall. He turned and looked at her, and she saw in his face something she recognized, not because she'd seen it on his face before, but because she'd seen it in the mirror. The look of a person who has just seen the floor drop out from under something they'd believed was solid. She didn't look away. She didn't pretend she hadn't heard. "How much?" she asked. His jaw tightened. "That's not your concern." "How much?" she asked again, not unkindly. A long pause. The kind where a man decides whether the pride is worth what he'll lose by holding on to it. $800, he said, in 30 days. She did the math instantly. She'd been doing the ranch accounts for 3 weeks. She knew exactly what Circle M's monthly operation cost, what the cattle revenue looked like, what was coming in and when. $800 in 30 days was impossible at the current pace. It was not impossible absolutely. "Sit down," she said. "Bring the ledger." He looked at her. Cole. First time she'd used his name. They both noticed it. "Bring the ledger." He brought the ledger. They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. She went through the numbers with the same steady precision she'd applied to her husband's collapsing practice accounts, without panic, without sentiment, with the clear-eyed arithmetic of someone who had learned that a bad number was still just a number, and numbers could be worked. She found things. An outstanding payment from a neighboring ranch for shared use of Circle M's equipment over the summer 3 months of unreceived payment that Cole had let slide, because he'd been in the middle of the busiest part of drive season and then forgotten. 2 suppliers, who were billing at rates higher than the agreed contracts, she found in the bottom of the desk drawer when she went to look. A sale of 3 horses she could suggest, not the working horses, not the core stock, but 3 that Tom had mentioned were surplus to the herd's actual need. When she added it up, she looked at him across the table. $640, she said. "That's what I can identify. You'd still need 160 more. Cole looked at the numbers she'd laid out. He looked at them for a long time. "The equipment payment from the Delaney Ranch," he said. "That's almost 3 months old. Delaney's good for it, I just haven't—" He stopped. "I should have collected it." "You were busy," she said. "I let it go because I didn't want to have to ask." His voice had a quality in it she hadn't heard before. Not self-pity, not complaint, but the honest, painful accounting of a man confronting the specific ways his grief had cost him. "After Ann died, I didn't want to need anything from anyone. I just put my head down and worked, and I let the parts of running this place that required asking for things, I let them slide." Silence. "I know something about that," she said. He looked at her. "Letting things slide because needing anything from anyone feels like an admission that you're not managing," she said. "My husband was dying, and I let 3 months of bills go unopened, because if I opened them, I would have to know exactly how bad it was, and knowing exactly how bad it was felt like it would break something I needed to keep intact to keep nursing him." Cole was very still. "It didn't break me," she said. "The bills were still there when I finally opened them. But I had to deal with them anyway. I would have been better off dealing with them sooner." He didn't say anything for a moment. The kitchen held the quiet, the way it always did at this hour. Not empty quiet, but the particular settledness of a room that had been busy all day and was resting. "I'll ride to Delaney in the morning," he said. "And the suppliers," she said. "The contracts are in the left desk drawer. I'll mark the relevant figures." He nodded. She got up to put the ledger away. Her back was stiff from 2 hours at the table, and she rolled her shoulder without thinking about it, and he was already standing, and he said without thinking either, "Are you all right?" She turned and looked at him. "I'm fine," she said. "Just the table is low for long sitting." He nodded, and something in him had shifted again. The practiced distance he usually maintained, the careful space he held between himself and everyone in his orbit. It had moved. Not disappeared, but moved to a different position, one that was several inches closer to where she was standing. "Eliza," he said. Second time, either of them had used a first name. She waited. "The previous cooks," he said. "They left because He stopped. "Chose different words. I didn't make it easy. I know that. I gave instructions through Tom because I didn't trust myself to—" Another stop. "When Ann died, I stopped talking. Not deliberately. It just there wasn't anyone I could talk to without them looking at me the way people look at grieving men, either too carefully or not carefully enough." She understood this exactly. She had lived this exactly. "I look at you," she said carefully, The way I would want someone to look at me. Like a person who is managing something difficult and doing it well and doesn't need to be either pitied or avoided. The thing that moved across his face this time was slower than the weather. It was something she didn't want to name too quickly, because naming things prematurely was how you got their shape wrong. She looked away first. "I'm going to start the bread dough for tomorrow," she said. "It needs to rise overnight." She heard him move behind her toward the door. "Eliza," he said from the doorway. She looked back. "Thank you," he said, "for the numbers, and for the rest of it." She nodded. He left. She stood at the work table in the quiet kitchen and put her hands in the flour and the familiar feeling of it. The cool, yielding weight of bread dough beginning was exactly what she needed. She had helped save this ranch tonight, not with a dramatic act, not with anything visible or declarable. With a ledger and 2 hours, and the same stubborn, careful arithmetic she'd applied to every hard thing in her life. The ranch was still in danger. 30 days was 30 days. But for the first time since arriving at Circle M, Cole Harrison had sat across a table from her and told her the truth. The whole truth, the financial and the emotional, the number and the reason behind the number. He had let her in. Not all the way, not yet, but enough. The dough came together under her hands. Outside the ranch was quiet. The men in the bunkhouse, the horses in the corral, the Texas sky doing what it always did, being enormous and indifferent, and in its indifference oddly comforting. She worked the dough. She thought about 30 days. And she thought for the first time since Robert died that 30 days was not nothing. 30 days was 30 mornings, 30 breakfasts, 30 small chances to do the next right thing. She had started with less. She would work with what she had. Cole rode to the Delaney Ranch at first light. Eliza knew because she heard him leave the particular sound of a single horse moving out at speed in the cold, before sunrise, purposeful and alone. She was already at the stove by then, the bread from last night's dough going into the oven. The coffee started the kitchen doing what it did every morning, without being asked. She didn't watch him go. But she listened until the sound of the horse faded into the distance, and then she went back to the bread, and she thought about 30 days, and she moved. Tom came in at 5:15, looking for coffee, and found her already deep into breakfast preparation. "Mr. Harrison's gone early," he said, helping himself to a cup. "Delaney Ranch," she said. Tom looked at her over the rim of his cup. "The equipment payment." "Yes." A pause. Tom was smart in the particular way of young men who observed more than they let on. He'd known something was wrong since the man with the document had come to the door, and he'd said nothing and waited, and now he was being told the shape of it in 2 words, and she could see him fitting it into what he already knew. "How bad?" he asked. "Manageable," she said. "If the next 30 days go right." He set his cup down. "What do you need from me?" She looked at him. 20 years old, sunburned, loyal, in the uncomplicated way of someone who hadn't yet had enough bad experiences to make loyalty complicated. "Keep the men steady," she said. "Don't tell them the details. But if anyone asks why Mr. Harrison is riding out early and working late, tell them it's the kind of thing that happens at the end of a hard season and he's handling it." "That's true," Tom said. "Yes," she said. "It is." He picked his cup back up, nodded once, and went to wake the others. She pulled the bread from the oven. It was perfect, dark-crusted and fragrant, the kind of bread that made a room feel different when it was in it. She set it on the work table and started on the eggs. Cole came back from Delaney's by mid-morning. She heard him in the yard, heard him talking briefly to Hector, heard his boots on the porch. He came to the kitchen door and stood there with his hat in his hand and said, $215. He paid the full amount. He'd been waiting for me to collect. She absorbed this. "That puts you at close enough that the horse sale covers the rest," he said. "I'm going to ride to the Kendrick place this afternoon. They've been looking to buy." "Which horses?" He told her. She did the math. Her expression must have shown something because he said, "It's enough, combined with the Delaney payment and what I can pull from the operating account without crippling next month." "You'll be short on operating through January," she said. "I know." His jaw was set. "I'll manage January when it comes." She looked at him, a man who had spent 3 years managing alone, and who was now, she realized, reporting to her, not because she'd asked for it, not because she'd insisted, but because somewhere in the last 4 weeks, he had started thinking of her as someone whose judgment he trusted enough to keep informed. She didn't comment on that. She just nodded and turned back to the stove. "Lunch in an hour," she said. She heard him exhale a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh, but something partway between the sound of a man who has just put down something heavy and is surprised by the relief of it. He left to find Hector. She made the best lunch she could from what she had. The mortgage payment was delivered to the bank in Willow Creek on the 27th day. Cole came back from town with the receipt in his breast pocket and said nothing about it at dinner. But the quality of his silence that evening was different from any silence he'd had before. Not the closed, braced silence of a man holding things at bay, but something that had air in it. Something that had breathed out. Eliza noticed. She said nothing. She served the meal and cleared the table and washed the dishes, and later when the kitchen was clean and she was writing tomorrow's menu, Cole came in with 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her without asking, and sat down across from her. This had become a thing. She couldn't have named exactly when it started, the late evenings, the kitchen table, the 2 cups of coffee that appeared without ceremony and signaled that they were going to sit together for a while in the particular quiet they had developed between them. It wasn't every night. Some nights he was too tired, or the work had run too long, or she could hear in the sounds of the house that he'd gone to bed early. But enough nights that it had become a pattern, and patterns, she knew, were how people told each other things without having to say them directly. "It's done," he said, wrapping his hands around his cup. "Good," she said. "The bank officer asked me how I'd found the shortfall." He looked at his coffee. "I told him I'd had help getting the accounts in order." She waited. "He asked if I'd hired a bookkeeper." A pause, and something shifted in his voice, something careful and deliberate, like a man choosing his footing on uncertain ground. "I told him I had a cook who turned out to be a good deal more than a cook." The kitchen held the sentence. "Is that all right?" he asked. "That I said that." "Yes," she said. "That's all right." He nodded. He drank his coffee. Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it against the roof, testing the eaves, and the fire in the main room was going by the sound of it, and the whole house had the sound of a place settling in against the cold. She had hung curtains in the dining room 2 weeks ago. Functional ones, plain cotton from fabric she'd found in a trunk in the storage room, and hemmed herself on Sunday afternoon. She hadn't asked. She'd done it and waited. Nobody said anything about the curtains except Jimmy, who said the room looked less like a bunkhouse overflow and more like an actual place, and Cole, who had looked at them and then at her, and said nothing, but had not asked her to take them down. "The men are different," Cole said. She looked at him. "Since you came." He said it without drama, just as fact. "I notice it at the table. The way they sit. The way they stay longer than they need to." Marcus laughed. Last Tuesday, actually laughed out loud at something Cobb said. "I haven't heard Marcus laugh in—" He paused, calculating, "longer than I want to admit." "Men laugh when they're comfortable," she said. "They weren't comfortable before." "No," she agreed. "They were fed. There's a difference." He looked at her. "You knew that when you came." "I learned it," she said. "I didn't come here knowing anything except that I needed the work. Everything else I worked out by watching." "What did you watch?" She considered how much to say. She had observed things at this ranch that were not her business to comment on, things that belonged to Cole's management of his own house, and crew things she had filed away without judgment. But he was asking. Directly, with the steady attention he gave to things he genuinely wanted to understand. "I watched 15 men eat in silence for the first week," she said. "And I thought these are not silent men by nature. Davis is quiet, but the others aren't. They were silent because the room had a quality that said, keep your head down and do the work and don't need anything extra. and that was coming from the top. Cole received this without flinching. From me. Yes. I did that. You were grieving, she said. And grief does things to the air around a person. People feel it without knowing what it is, and they respond by getting smaller, quieter, more careful. Your men were taking their cues from you. You told them without words that this was a place for surviving, not for living, and they did what you told them. He was quiet for a long moment. And now, he asked. She looked at him steadily. Now they're starting to live a little, because someone in this house decided to put curtains up and make apple pie and stay when it would have been easier to leave. And that changed the message. He looked at the curtains in the dining room doorway. He looked at them for a while. Anne would have liked you, he said. The sentence landed quietly between them. Tell me about her, Eliza said. He looked surprised. Most people she'd found did not ask grieving people to talk about the ones they'd lost. They avoided it believing they were being kind, not understanding that the avoidance said the person is gone and should not be mentioned rather than the person mattered, and still does. She was practical, he said slowly, like someone taking something out of a drawer they haven't opened in a long time and checking whether it was still intact. People expected her to be soft because she was small, and she laughed easily. She wasn't soft. She had a steel thread running right through the middle of her. She ran this house the same way you do everything organized, everything purposeful, but with a warmth underneath it that made it feel like more than just efficiency. She sounds formidable, Eliza said. She was. His voice had something in it now, not the suppressed grief of someone trying to hold it together, but the fuller, more honest quality of someone actually remembering rather than just mourning. She told me once that the difference between a house and a home was whether the people in it believed they were worth feeding well. She made Sunday dinners from the beginning, from the very first month. She was right, Eliza said, about the feeding. I know that now. He looked at her. I didn't continue it. After she died, I think I decided that if I made it just survival, just function, then losing things wouldn't hurt as much. If there was nothing worth having, there was nothing left to lose. Eliza thought about the bare walls, the absent curtains, the meals that had been adequate and nothing more. Did it work? She asked. Making it just function. No, he said. It didn't hurt less. It just there was less of everything. Less hurt and less everything else too. She understood this with her whole body. I tried the same thing after Robert died, she said. I made myself very small and very practical, and I told myself that was strength. Getting through each day without falling apart. I was very good at not falling apart. She looked at her coffee cup. I was not good at anything else. What changed? He asked. I ran out of money, she said. And he almost smiled, the reluctant, almost smile she'd catalogued at least a dozen times now. Which forced me to move. And moving forced me to need things again. And needing things again forced me to be somewhere other than inside my own grief. She looked up at him. This kitchen changed something. This kitchen and these men. Being needed, actually needed for real and specific things, that's what cracked it open. Cole was looking at her with the expression she still couldn't fully name, the one that was slower than weather, that moved through his face like something deciding whether to stay. You cracked it open for me too, he said quietly. For all of us. She looked away first. She always looked away first because what she saw in his face when he looked at her that way was something she wasn't ready to hold directly yet. Not because she didn't want to, because she'd been wrong before about what she deserved and she was being careful. More coffee, she said. He stood and got the pot himself, which he'd started doing 2 weeks ago, which meant he no longer felt like a visitor in the kitchen he technically owned. He refilled both cups and sat back down. I want to ask you something, he said. She waited. The suppliers, the ones billing above contract. You found those in the desk drawer. I found the contracts in the desk drawer, she corrected. The suppliers were billing at whatever they thought they could get away with. How long do you think that's been going on? She'd thought about this. At least a year, possibly longer. The contracts have the original rates. The invoices deviated starting... She thought back to the ledger entries. Starting about 4 months after your wife died. Cole's face went still. Someone decided I wouldn't be paying attention. Someone decided you were in a state where discrepancies might not be caught. She said, careful but honest. It may not have been malicious. People take advantage of inattention without necessarily planning to. The dry goods supplier, he said. Pearson. He's billing 15% above contract. I've used Pearson for 8 years. His voice had gone flat in the way it did when he was controlling something. I trusted him. People you trust are the ones who can disappoint you most effectively. She said, not without gentleness. It doesn't mean the trust was wrong. It means the trust needed watching. He stood abruptly. Not in anger, in the restless energy of a man who has just recalculated something and needs to move. He went to the window and stood there. I need to renegotiate those contracts, he said. Yes. And I need to do the accounts myself, going forward, or at least... He turned and looked at her. Would you be willing to continue with the ledger with me? Going through it together. She looked at him. He was asking her to stay. Not in those words. But that was what he was asking for, a future in which they sat at this table together and worked through the numbers of keeping this ranch alive. A future that required her continued presence as a fact rather than a possibility. Yes, she said. I'm willing. He nodded. He sat back down. He picked up his coffee. Outside, the wind hit the house harder, and the fire shifted in the main room, and the curtains in the dining room doorway moved slightly in the draft. Those curtains, he said, looking at them. Anne would have chosen that exact color. Eliza looked at them. Plain cotton, the color of wheat before harvest. I didn't choose it, she said. It was what was in the trunk. I know, he said. That's what I mean. She didn't know exactly what he meant, but she felt it the way he meant it, the layered thing underneath the words, the way the universe sometimes arranged small coincidences that felt like messages. She held it quietly and didn't press it. Maud. What happened over the following 2 weeks was not a romance in the declared dramatic sense. It was quieter than that. It was 2 people who had each been cracked open by loss, sitting in the same kitchen night after night, finding that the shape of what they'd lost and the shape of what they still had were unexpectedly compatible. He fixed things. The latch had been first, but then the loose board on the kitchen step that she'd been stepping around for 3 weeks, and then the stovepipe fitting that had been slightly off, making the flue inefficient. He fixed things without being asked, which meant he was paying attention, and paying attention meant she was real to him in the specific way that mattered. She cooked. But more than that, she remembered. She remembered that Marcus's biscuits needed to be softer, that Jimmy liked extra sugar in his coffee, that Hector would eat anything, but could be made visibly happy by anything that reminded him of home. She remembered these things and acted on them without ceremony, and the men felt it the way people feel being remembered, as evidence that they mattered enough to be held in someone's attention. And Cole. Cole started taking his coffee on the porch in the mornings, which he hadn't done before, and twice she had come out with a second cup without being asked, and they had stood together watching the ranch come alive in the early light, not talking, just standing in the same direction, which was its own kind of conversation. Tom noticed. Tom noticed everything and kept it to himself with the discretion of someone who understood that some things needed room to develop without commentary. Marcus noticed too, and said nothing, and once caught Eliza's eye across the dinner table with an expression that was as close to a smile as his face typically got, which she received and returned, and that was all. On a Friday evening, 3.5 weeks after the mortgage crisis, Cole came into the kitchen while she was making the week's supply list and set a small package on the table next to her hand. She looked at it, brown paper tied with kitchen string. "What is this?" she asked. "Open it," he said. She untied the string and unfolded the paper. Inside was a small book, not new clearly from somewhere. It had been sitting a while, bound in dark cloth, the title worn but readable. A collection of American poetry, the kind that used to sit in parlors in good Philadelphia homes. She looked up at him. "I found it in the storage room," he said. "Anne had it from before. I thought—" He stopped. "I remembered you said you'd been going through the storage room for fabric. I thought if you hadn't found it, you might like to have it." She held the book. She had not cried once since arriving at Circle M Ranch. Not when her back ached and her feet hurt and the stove was difficult. Not when she'd cleaned up after difficult meals and stood in the kitchen alone with the arithmetic of how far she'd come and how uncertain the future was. Not when she'd set Jimmy's arm and felt her hands shake afterward. Not once. She was not going to cry now. She was very clear about that. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was steady, which was a significant personal achievement. "You're welcome," he said. And then, because he was Cole Harrison, and this was how he showed things, he went to the shelf and got the coffee pot and refilled her cup and sat down across from her. She put the book next to her supply list. She picked up her pencil. He watched her write for a moment. "Read me something," he said. She looked up. "From the book," he said. "If you want to." She looked at him. His expression was open in a way she'd almost stopped expecting, in the careful, tentative way of someone who has decided to stop bracing for the next hard thing long enough to ask for something good. She opened the book to the middle and read him a poem about autumn and rivers and the particular quality of light on water in the late afternoon. Her voice was steady. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the wind had gone quiet for once, and the ranch had the particular hush of a place where everyone is finally genuinely at rest. When she finished, she closed the book. Cole hadn't moved. He had his forearms on the table and his coffee cup in front of him, and he was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man who has just been reminded of something he'd been afraid he'd forgotten permanently. "Again," he said quietly. She opened the book to another page and read again. And the kitchen, which had been a workplace and a battlefield and a site of crisis and a place of gradual, stubborn repair, the kitchen became something else that night. Something that didn't have a single word for it, but that both of them recognized in the way you recognize something you've been looking for without knowing you were looking. It felt like home, not the home they'd each lost. Something new. Something that was being made from the particular combination of what they both had left after the losses. Her stubbornness and his steadiness. Her warmth and his silence. Her ability to feed people and his ability to build the structure around which feeding could happen. She read 3 poems before she stopped. He refilled the coffee cups without comment. They sat together in the kitchen until the fire in the main room had burned low, and the ranch was fully deeply quiet around them, and neither of them said anything about what the sitting together meant, because some things were more true when they were allowed to simply exist rather than being named too quickly. She closed the book and set it down. "I should start the morning prep," she said. "It's barely 10 o'clock, he said. "I start early," she said. He looked at her with the almost smile. "I know you do," he said. "I've heard you every morning since you arrived." She stared at him. "You've heard me." "My room is above the kitchen," he said simply. "I've heard you every morning at 4:45, sometimes 4:30. A pause. It was... He chose the word carefully. It was a good sound. To hear someone working in the house. She absorbed this. He had been listening to her every morning, for over a month. And the sound of her working in his kitchen at 4:30 in the morning had been a good sound, a reassuring sound, the sound of a house that had someone in it who intended to stay. She looked at him. He looked back. "Good night, Cole," she said. "Good night, Eliza," he said. She gathered her things and went to her room, and she sat on the edge of the bed with the poetry book in her hands. And she thought about a man who had spent 3 years in a house full of silence, who had heard her working every morning, and found it a comfort without until tonight ever saying so. She opened the book to the first page. There in handwriting she didn't recognize, neat and certain, the handwriting of a woman who had known her own mind, was a name. Anne Harrison. Written the way people write in books they intend to keep. Eliza ran her thumb across the letters. Then she set the book on her nightstand, and she closed her eyes. And for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, she did not spend the last minutes before sleep running the arithmetic of survival. She just let the day settle complete and whole exactly as it was. She woke at 4:30 to the sound of the wind. Not the ordinary wind, not the steady push of Texas weather doing what Texas weather did. This was different. This had a weight to it, a pressure that she felt in her chest before she was fully awake, the kind of sound that made the walls of a building seem suddenly less certain than they'd been the night before. She was dressed and in the kitchen by 4:40. The fire in the stove was already going. She stopped when she saw it. Someone had come down before her and laid the fire and got it started, and there was only one person in this house besides her, and he had his room above the kitchen, and she had been told he heard her every morning at 4:30. She put the kettle on and said nothing about it to anyone. Outside, the wind hit the house again harder this time, testing the south wall, with the blunt force of something that had been building across open country for miles, and had arrived at Circle M with everything it had gathered on the way. She heard the bunkhouse door slam. She heard voices in the yard, men already up, already moving, already reading what the weather was saying. Cole came downstairs at 5. He looked at her, and then at the window, and then back at her. "Storm coming," he said. "Bad one. The sky's wrong to the north." "How long?" she asked. 6 hours, maybe less. He was already in his coat. "I need the men out now. We have to get the cattle in from the north pasture before it hits, or we'll lose half of them to the draw. There's a creek that floods." "What do you need from me?" she asked. He stopped. He looked at her with the particular attention he gave her. Now, not the assessing look of the first day, not the careful distance of the early weeks, but the direct, trusting look of a man who has decided someone is essential. "Hold the ranch," he said. "Keep the men who stay warm and fed. If anyone comes in hurt, you know what to do." "I know what to do," she said. He held her gaze for 1 second longer than necessary. Then he went out. She started cooking. The storm hit at 9 in the morning, with the sudden total commitment of bad weather that has been patient long enough. 3 men had stayed behind Marcus, whose knee had been giving him trouble all week, and who Cole had ordered to stay without argument. Jimmy, whose arm was still healing, and who had argued extensively and lost. And a hand named Wheeler, who had taken a bad step on the porch in the pre-dawn rush, and twisted his ankle hard enough that walking was a negotiation. 3 men, 1 woman, and a ranch that was going to take a beating. Eliza had spent the 3 hours before the storm hit doing what she always did when she was afraid moving. She made a full pot of beans with the good smoked meat. She made biscuits in 3 batches. She made coffee that could have stood a spoon upright. She filled every available container with water from the pump before the yard became impassable. She brought in extra wood from the porch and stacked it by the stove until the kitchen had more wood than it could reasonably use, because she understood that the storm could last a day or more, and cold was the enemy she could actually fight. Marcus watched her do all of this from the chair she'd put him in by the stove, and didn't say a word, which was his version of approval. Jimmy tried to help with his one good arm, and she gave him tasks calibrated to exactly what he could do, keeping the fire fed, watching the beans, carrying things that didn't require 2 hands, because she'd learned that injured young men needed to be useful more than they needed to be rested. Wheeler sat at the kitchen table with his ankle wrapped and asked if there was anything he could do. "Tell me something," she said without looking up from the bread she was making. "About yourself. Anything." He looked surprised. Then slowly he told her about growing up in Missouri, about his father's farm, about the particular quality of summer mornings in a place where everything was green, which was so different from Texas that he still sometimes woke up surprised by the color of things. She listened. She kept working. The storm raged outside and the kitchen was warm, and the 4 of them held the ranch together in the way that people hold things together when they don't have any other option, by staying and feeding each other and keeping the fire going. At 11, the wind tore something loose on the roof of the nearest outbuilding. They heard it a crack, then a sustained tearing sound. Then Marcus said, "The planking on the tack shed." without particular alarm the way he said most things. "Can it wait?" she asked. "Has to," he said. "Nobody's going out in this." She accepted that and went back to the bread. At noon, she served lunch, beans, biscuits, the last of the apple butter she'd been hoarding, and the four of them sat at the kitchen table and ate while the storm made its arguments against every wall of the house simultaneously. It was, she thought, the strangest lunch she'd ever cooked, and also not the worst she'd ever had. Jimmy said, "Do you think they're all right out there?" He meant Cole. He meant Hector and Davis and Cobb and the others. "Yes," she said. "How do you know?" She looked at him. "Because Cole Harrison has been running this ranch for 12 years in Texas weather, and the men with him know what they're doing, and worrying about it won't change the outcome either way. Eat your biscuit." Jimmy ate his biscuit. Marcus made a sound that might have been a laugh. She got up to check the stove. They came back at 3 in the afternoon. She heard them before she saw them, the sound of horses in the yard. Men's voices, the particular controlled chaos of an operation returning from hard work in bad conditions. She was at the door before she'd decided to move. They came in from the storm in ones and twos, soaked and cold, and carrying the particular exhaustion of men who have been fighting weather and livestock for 6 hours in deteriorating conditions. Hector first, then Davis, then Cobb, with someone's horse in addition to his own, then 3 others. She counted as they came through automatically, because she needed to know the number. Cole came in last. He was on foot, not on horseback, and he was holding his left side in a way that he was trying not to make obvious, and was not succeeding. His coat was dark with rain, and there was a cut above his eyebrow that had bled down the side of his face and dried there rust-colored against the cold pale of his skin. She crossed the yard to him without thinking about it. "What happened?" she said. "Fence line came down in the draw," he said. "Horse spooked. I went over." He was talking in the compressed, factual way of men who are hurt and are managing the hurt by keeping the account of it very precise. "Nothing's broken. I checked." "You checked yourself?" "Yes." "Come inside," she said. "I need to see to the—" "Tom is seeing to it," she said. "Come inside." He came inside. She sat him at the kitchen table. Her table, the table where they'd gone through the ledger and talked about Anne and read poetry, and she looked at the cut above his eyebrow, and the way he held his ribs, and the color of his face, which was several shades off from where it should be. "Breathe in," she said. He breathed in. His jaw tightened. "Cracked," she said. "1, maybe 2 ribs. Not broken through. It's going to hurt for 3 weeks, and you need to breathe carefully, and you cannot go back out in the cold today." "The cattle are accounted for," Tom said from the doorway where he had appeared with the quiet efficiency that was becoming his trademark. "Hector's got them. We lost 4 from the north herd. They went into the draw before we got there. Everything else is in." Cole absorbed this. 4. "Could have been 40, Tom said. "You got there in time." Cole closed his eyes for a moment. The particular expression of a man doing the math on a bad outcome and finding it better than he'd feared. She cleaned the cut on his forehead. He sat still for it with the stoic patience of someone who has decided that flinching is optional. She could feel the tension in him, the effort of sitting quietly while his ranch was still in the process of being accounted for, the effort of allowing someone to tend to him, which was its own kind of difficulty for a man who had spent 3 years tending everything himself. "It's not deep," she said. "It won't scar badly." "I'm not worried about the scar," he said. "I know," she said. "Hold still." She worked carefully. Her hands were steady, steadier than they'd been when she'd set Jimmy's arm, because she'd learned in the intervening weeks that her hands knew how to be steady when they were needed. It was something she'd discovered about herself at Circle M. She was better in emergencies than she'd ever known. The steadiness that felt like stubbornness in ordinary life turned out to be exactly right when things went wrong. When she finished, she stepped back. He looked up at her. His face was close. She'd been close enough to work and hadn't thought about the proximity until this moment, and his expression was open in the way it only was in the kitchen in the late evenings, the way it wasn't anywhere else. "Everyone's back," he said. "All the men." "I counted," she said. He looked at her. You counted. As they came in, she said. I needed to know the number. Something moved across his face, slow the way all the real things moved across his face, not quick and surface level, but deep and deliberate. You were worried, he said. She held his gaze. She wasn't going to deny it. She had stood at this door for 3 hours counting the things she could control. The fire, the food, the water, the warmth, and the thing she couldn't control was the number of men who'd come back. And she had worried about all of them, and one of them most of all, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. Yes, she said. He reached up and put his hand over hers where it rested on the table beside him. His hand was cold from the ride, and the storm, and hers was warm from the kitchen, and the contrast of it was so simple and so complete that she felt it in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Neither of them said anything. The kitchen held them the warmth of it, the smell of beans and coffee and biscuits, and the particular mix of wood smoke and something baking that had become in 6 weeks the smell of a place she belonged. Tom was suddenly very busy in the next room. Marcus had a coughing fit that required both his hands and most of his attention. Jimmy became fascinated by something outside the window. She looked at Cole's hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held his. He slept for 2 hours in the afternoon, which he would not have done if she hadn't told him, in the voice she used, when the voice was not a suggestion that cracked ribs required rest, and that the ranch would stand without him for 2 hours, and that she would personally wake him if anything required his attention. He went. She fed the men in shifts. The ones who'd been out in the storm needed hot food and warmth, and not to be asked to tell the story yet, so she gave them the beans and the biscuits and the coffee, and let them thaw in their own time. Hector ate 3 bowls of beans, and then put his head down on his forearms at the table, and was asleep in under 2 minutes. She put a blanket over his shoulders and left him. Davis sat at the table long after he'd finished eating, and stared at nothing in particular, doing the internal accounting that men do after they've been in danger and come through it. She refilled his coffee without being asked, and he said without looking up, "Thank you, Mrs. Carter." Not for the coffee. She knew that. "Any time," she said, and meant it in all the ways it could be meant. Cobb ate said best beans in Texas and went to the bunkhouse. She cleaned the kitchen and started dinner. Cole came downstairs at 5:30. He moved carefully, one hand light against the wall on the stairs, not holding, just aware of where the wall was. He came into the kitchen and stood in the doorway and looked at the state of it. The state of it was dinner, almost ready. Kitchen clean, men fed and accounted for, fire solid. The ranch having come through a serious storm with less damage than it might have because the people in it had done their jobs. He looked at her. "Sit down," she said. "I'll bring you a plate." "Eliza." "Your ribs need you sitting," she said. "Sit." He sat. She brought him a plate, the good cut of the beef she'd been saving the beans with the smoked meat. The bread that had come out perfectly, the last of the butter. She set it in front of him and poured his coffee, and then brought her own plate and sat across from him, because the men were eating in the dining room and the kitchen table was theirs, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. He looked at his plate. He looked at her. "You held this place together today," he said. "I kept the fire going and made lunch," she said. "Eliza." His voice had the quality it got when he wanted her to actually hear something. "You held it together. Not just the food. The men who stayed, Marcus told me. Said you kept them from going to pieces. Said Jimmy was actually useful today, which Marcus believes is a miracle." She thought about Jimmy carrying wood with one arm, proud and careful. "He needed to be useful," she said. "I know," Cole said. "You knew that. You gave him something to do that mattered and told him it mattered, and that's—" He stopped. "That's not nothing. That's not just cooking." She looked at her coffee. "When I came here," she said, "I thought I was coming to cook. I thought survival was the whole project. Get through the day. Get through the week. Get through enough weeks that I had enough money to get somewhere else and start again." She paused. "I stopped thinking about somewhere else around the 3rd week." He was very still. "Why?" he asked. She looked at him directly. Because somewhere else stopped being a thing I wanted. The kitchen held the sentence. Cole put down his fork. I have something I need to say, he said. I've been working out how to say it for about 2 weeks, and I'm not going to get it right, so I'm just going to say the true version and trust you to hear what I mean. She waited. When Anne died, I decided, not consciously, but I decided that this ranch was enough, that the work was enough, that if I kept my head down and the cattle moved and the accounts balanced, I could be not happy but functional. A functioning man is not the same as a happy one, but it felt safer. He looked at his hands on the table. And then you arrived, and you burned the biscuits on the first day, and argued with me about the stove, and fixed the accounts, and set Jimmy's arm, and made Sunday dinner, and read me poetry at 10 o'clock at night, and he stopped. And, she said, and I stopped being just functional, he said. And it scared me, because the last time I was more than functional, I lost everything, and the losing of it was... His jaw worked. It was the kind of thing that makes a man decide not to have anything worth losing again. She understood this. She understood it in her bones. I made the same decision, she said. After Robert, I made myself very careful about wanting things. Are you still making that decision? He asked. She looked at him. The man who had fixed her window latch before dawn, who had kept the fire laid before she got to the kitchen on the worst morning of the year, who had given her a dead woman's book of poetry and asked her to read it aloud, and who had said again in the voice of someone receiving the best gift they'd been offered in years, who had named his grief to her in the dark kitchen and let her name hers in return, and who had in the accumulated weight of all the small honest things become the most real person in her life. No, she said, I'm not still making that decision. He reached across the table and took her hand, not the way he'd held it that afternoon covering it, but fully his fingers through hers, the grip of a man who is not being tentative. I'm not asking you to stay as a cook, he said. I want to be clear about that. I'm asking you to stay because this house is different with you in it, and I am different with you in it, and I don't want to go back to what either of us was before. She held his hand. That's not a question, she said. No, he said. I'm working up to the question. Give me a moment. She almost smiled. She let him have his moment. Eliza Carter, he said, will you? He stopped. Started again. I know I'm not easy. I know this ranch is hard, and the winters are hard, and I'm a man who forgets to say things and has to be reminded that people need more than function. I know all of that. I know it too, she said. I'm asking you to stay anyway, he said. As my wife, not because I need a cook or because the ranch is in better shape with you managing the accounts, or because the men are different with you here, though all of those things are true. Because I want to build something with you. Whatever comes next, I want to build it with you in it. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the storm had passed. She could hear it moving east, taking its noise with it, leaving behind the particular silence of weather that has spent itself and gone. She thought about Philadelphia. She thought about the furniture she'd sold, and the house she'd left, and the long, hard, improbable road that had brought her to this kitchen in Texas with this man's hand in hers. She thought about the morning she'd stepped off the stagecoach with nothing in her bag that mattered except a jar of jam and the willingness to try. She thought about bread dough and cracked ribs, and a latch fixed before dawn, and a book with another woman's name in the front that had been given to her with the simplest and most honest generosity she'd ever received. She thought about what she'd told Jimmy the morning she'd set his arm. It's the kind of broken that heals cleanly if it's handled right. Yes, she said. Cole Harrison's hand tightened on hers. He didn't say anything right away. He just held on, and she held back, and the kitchen that had been a workplace and a battlefield and a place of repair held them both in the warmth it had accumulated over 6 weeks of good fires and hard mornings, and the particular alchemy of two people finding each other in the ruins of what they'd survived. They were married on the last Saturday of November. No church, the weather, and the distance made it impractical, and neither of them needed the building. The circuit preacher who came through Willow Creek every 6 weeks happened to be in town, and Cole rode to get him on Friday, and the ceremony happened in the main room of the house, with every man on the Circle M crew standing in their best shirts and Marcus in a jacket that Eliza suspected he'd owned since before the war, and had saved for occasions that mattered. Tom cried. He turned away and did the jaw-set thing that young men do when they're crying and don't want anyone to notice, and Marcus stood next to him and said nothing and did not look at him, which was the kindest thing Eliza had ever seen Marcus do. Jimmy had his arm out of the sling by then. He cheered loud enough when the preacher finished that the horses in the corral registered an opinion. Hector shook Cole's hand for a long time without saying anything, then turned to Eliza and said, "My grandmother would have liked you," and she understood that there was no higher thing he could have offered. Cobb predictably ate more than everyone else at the dinner afterward, and said the food was the best he'd ever had, which everyone understood was his wedding gift. Davis shook her hand at the end of the evening quiet as always, and said, "This is a good place now." He looked around the room, the curtains, the warmth, the men who were full and at ease, the house that had a sound to it that was different from the silence it had held for 3 years. It wasn't before, now it is. She stood in the kitchen that night, her kitchen unambiguously hers now, in a way that had no asterisk or condition attached, and she listened to the ranch settle around her. Cole came to find her. He stood in the doorway and looked at her in the kitchen with the expression she'd catalogued and kept, and would keep for the rest of her life, the one that was slower than weather that moved through his face like something that had decided to stay. "You're in the kitchen," he said. "Habit," she said. "It's your wedding night," he said. "I know what night it is," she said. She looked at him. She looked at the stove, the work table, the shelf where the accounts ledger sat next to the book of poetry with Anne's name in the front. "I was just saying goodnight to it." He came into the kitchen and stood beside her. "It's not going anywhere," he said. "I know," she said. "I just wanted a moment." He gave her the moment. They stood together in the kitchen that had been the beginning of everything that had been a battlefield and a medical station, and a place of crisis and a place of slow, stubborn repair. The kitchen where she had burned the first biscuits and found the errors in the ledger, and set a young man's broken arm and read poetry aloud to a man who needed to remember what it felt like to receive something good. The kitchen where 6 weeks ago a woman with nothing had arrived and decided that nothing was still enough to start from. She turned and looked at Cole Harrison. Her husband, this unexpected fact. This man who had remembered how to be more than functional because someone had refused to let the house be less than alive. "Ready," he said. "Yes," she said. She took his hand, and she left the kitchen with the fire banked and the bread set to rise for morning, and she walked out of the room that had saved her into the life that was waiting. Eliza Carter had come to Texas with a leather bag, a jar of jam, and the bare stubborn will to survive. She left that kitchen a woman who had done something harder than surviving. She had chosen with full knowledge of the cost and the risk to live again. And that in the end was the only victory that had ever truly mattered.